Hi everybody, I want to thank everybody for tuning in to another video. I'm Dana Claiborne, language arts tutor, and today I am focusing on another concept that pertains to writing, but this time the focus is on literary writing. I am sharing a literary paragraph format that I actually learned from one of my students, and they learned it from school, so it's something that is popular as an approach to do literary paragraphs or literary analysis paragraphs in school. And so if you struggle or have struggled to respond to a literary analysis question or a literature question in paragraph form, this technique could help you. It is called CEI, and if you've heard of it before, or you might have done it before in school, that's great. I'm just gonna kind of show my style of constructing it, and I think it's a really good way to respond to a literature question in paragraph form. Many times in school, students have writing assignments in which they have to respond to a question they're asked about a story or poem, and teacher could ask for them to do it using paragraphs. Or I think sometimes they were called rafts, and the way some other students or the way some other teachers presented those writing assignments. So this format, I think, is very helpful and a great simple way to approach responding to a literature question. Okay, and so I'm going to use a PowerPoint version of guide. This is the guide that I use to share this particular concept with students in session today. So let's get right to it. And I'm gonna switch over to DVE, and here I am. Am I there? Yep, I'm there. Okay, so I just call this the analytical paragraphs presentation, and what it does is it just kind of shows you a technique for how to respond to a question that you're asked involving a short story or poem or even a novel, any kind of literary assignment that asks you about a specific literary element. And there's a bunch of different components or literary elements that can show up in short stories and poetry. And so in session, we talk about some of these, like plot and setting and characterization. And so hopefully those terms or those kind of literary components are somewhat familiar. Maybe you don't know all of them, but just know that you could be asked, to answer a question that involves a component of literature, like one of these. Okay, so we say, what is the purpose of an analytical paragraph? Well, it's meant to do exactly that, to show that you've interacted with and have understood a certain literary element and its function within a broad literary work like a poem or short story. Okay, so when I say literary work, that's what I mean. I mean a poem or a short story or a novel or something that involved reading. Okay, so English teachers, one thing that's really, really important, I think, when writing literary analysis responds to anything, even if it's just short answer questions, it's really important to get into the psyche of an English teacher. I suspect that many English teachers, part of the reason why students have had trouble with some of the grading of some of their English teachers is because they haven't always understood what the English teacher is after. And I tell students this: just like a math teacher wants to know that you can analyze and that you can calculate and that you can use formula and you can use steps, that kind of thing. Just like a math teacher wants to see that you can do those things, an English teacher wants to see that you have interacted with the literary work and have noticed and recognized literary components inside the literary work. So they want to see, based on your written response, they want to see that you have understood what the author was trying to do, the literary components the author was intending to use. So if they're expressing foreshadow, if they're hinting at something in the future, the English teacher wants to see that you recognize that that's what they were doing. Or if they're using symbolism, if something is symbolic and representative of something else, English teacher wants to see if you recognize that. If they're intending to convey a character's characterization, English teacher wants to see if you recognize literary components in literature. And if your response to a question can show them that you understood and interacted with the literature and recognized those things and understood what the author was trying to do, a lot of times I think that could gain you some points in the psyche and in the mind of an English teacher, because that's what they want to see. They want to see your literary interaction. So your responses to questions, a lot of those literary analysis questions are engineered to get those kinds of responses out of you. And so if you understand what the question is meant to give you, it helps you determine, it helps you know how to write a good response. Okay. I've probably talked too much about that, but let me keep going. That's what analytical paragraphs are for. Okay, so they directly analyze parts of the passage and explain what is occurring, and considering the particular literary device that you're discussing. All right. So what does a literary analysis question look like? And so here we use a sample. And so an analytical prompt question will often ask about a particular literary element of the story. Now, it doesn't always, but often they do, or they could, rather, okay? And so here is a sample question. I'm just going to make it a little bit smaller. It says, how does the author use characterization to create conflict in the story? So we see actually this question is asking about two literary elements. Characterization is one, and characterization just means the narrator's attempt to describe what a character is like. Okay, so that's what characterization is. That's one. How it's used to create conflict, and conflict is another one. That's another major literary element in that can show up, or that does show up in every single story or short story. Okay, so how does one cause or create the other? They're asking, how does characterization create conflict? Before you can answer a question like this, you got to make sure, the first thing, as simple as it may sound, is you got to make sure you're understanding what they're asking you. You got to say to yourself, what are they asking me? Okay, they're asking how characterization, which means character traits and physical features. I'll just write that in here. How does that create conflict? I'll say, or physical features. Conflict means the problem faced by the protagonist. Okay? And so let me make it smaller so it doesn't look so convoluted, or so it doesn't look so technical. There we go. And I'm just going to make it a little bit smaller, that way I just want it to be clear. And let's deal with the line spacing just a little bit. I want to deal with that line spacing just a little bit. All right, there we go. How does the author use characterization to create conflict in the story? Okay. Now, this is the format for how to answer this question. And so when I say CEI, this was the popular format that a student taught me. All right, isn't that ironic A student teaches the teacher. That happens to me all the time. Students show me stuff all the time. And so a special thank you. Okay? So this is the format. And I began to have students do it once I saw it. This is the format. The first sentence of the paragraph is the claim. And the claim is one sentence that directly answers the prompt question. Understand that this is not something that you just kind of come up with quickly necessarily. You have to think, even though it is the first sentence and even though it is only one sentence, it is still something you have to think about in order to come up with the idea. So often when you show students formats like this, I feel like they feel like sometimes, if they can't just write it immediately, something's wrong with them. Not necessarily. It's okay to have to think about it, to think about your response for a bit. And that is definitely the case with the claim. The claim is one sentence, but you have to think about your response to it and think about the story or literary piece before you can come up with the one sentence that answers the question. But that's what the claim is. It is one sentence that directly answers the main prompt question or assignment question. Okay? So after you've written the claim, it's as a direct answer to this question here. Then you're gonna add the next step underneath the claim, which is the next part of the paragraph. That is the evidence. And the evidence is taken directly from the text. So you look for something in the text that proves what you're saying in the claim. Okay? So whatever your claim says, you begin to dig into the passage or the text, the poem or story or whatever it is, for a direct quote that proves what you're saying. Okay? Now, you're going to copy and paste that underneath the claim. But here's the thing. You always want to give some kind of embed to the quote. And embed just means to introduce the quote using an intro phrase or perhaps a sentence idea that kind of announces what the quote is about first before you just copy and paste it and stick it in there. Okay, so an embed, easy embed could be just an intro phrase, like these down here, according to the passage. You see, just acknowledging that, hey, this is something that came from the text, or as stated by such and such in the text. Okay, and so those are phrases that you could use to embed your quote. Important thing to do. All right, you want to do that before you copy and paste and just drop the quote in there. All right, but the evidence is taken directly from the text, and it's something that happened or something that's written that proves what you're saying in the claim. Okay, so I got claim first, then the evidence, which is going to be a middle part of the paragraph. And then the final part of the paragraph is the I, which is for interpretation. The interpretation is the biggest part of the paragraph. It does two things. Number one, it directly explains what's happening in the quote. You see, the quote taken from the story would not be clear to somebody who had never read it. So if somebody who's reading your paragraph had never read the story or the poem, and they just saw that piece of a quote in the middle of your paragraph, they likely wouldn't know what that whole thing was about or what was happening in it. So the interpretation takes a moment or takes a sentence or a couple sentences to interpret what was happening in that part of the story. So it explains, it zeroes in on that part of the story and explains what was going on. Okay, what was happening. Then, in the second part of the interpretation, you also have to explain or want to explain how that quote or how what's happening in that quote proves what you're saying in the claim. Because remember, everything is about proving the claim. Okay? So, two parts to the interpretation. Explain what's happening in the quote that you chose, okay? And then explain how it proves what you're saying in the claim. So, claim first, then evidence, then interpretation. All of that together in one paragraph. So let's take a look at the sample. It asks the question, once again, how does the author use characterization to create conflict in the story? And we use the Hunger Games for this. So, spoiler alert, if you have not read the Hunger Games, you might not be too particularly keen to watch this part, okay? Because we're gonna give you a little bit of the plot from the Hunger Games in our response to this. So, claim, evidence, interpretation. How does the author use characterization, which means character traits, to create conflict? How does it happen? So let's look at the claim. Claim is in red. How does the author use characterization to create conflict? What I'll do, just for the sake of making it on the same page, I'm gonna just kind of put it on here, the same. That way it's clear. Okay. How does the author use characterization to create conflict? Well, here's the claim here. Claim says the author uses Katniss's bravery and dedication for her family to drive the conflict of the story. Does everybody see how that sentence is a direct answer to this question? Okay? Katniss, the author uses Katniss's bravery and dedication for her family. What's that? That's characterization. Those are her character traits. She's brave and dedicated to her family. All right? So we say the author uses Katniss's bravery and dedication for her family to drive the conflict of the story. Okay. Now, what we got to have next is the E, which is for evidence, right? That's this middle part. So the evidence is here. Okay? Evidence, we start with the embed, which is in orange. It says Katniss demonstrates her bravery and dedication to her family on many key accounts. One major occurrence happened in the beginning of the story, so we're embedding it. She provides the account in the text saying. Now that we have embedded it and kind of introduced it, here's the quote right here. I reach her just as she's about to mount the steps. With one sweep of my arm, I push her behind me. I volunteer, I gasp. I volunteer as tribute. Okay, so that is the quote taken from the Hunger Games that proves what we're saying about how Katniss's bravery and dedication for her family drives the conflict of the story. Okay, so this quote and this embed proves what we're saying in the claim. All right, now the last piece is interpretation, which explains what's happening in the quote and why it proves the claim. So here it is. Here's the interpretation in blue. In this segment of the passage, so what we got to do is we got to explain what's happening in this quote first. All right? And it says, in this segment of the passage, Katniss volunteers to save her sister from the Hunger Games. It proves her bravery to sacrifice her life to save her sister. The author uses this example of indirect characterization to show Katniss's bravery and love for her family. So what did we just explain? We just explained what was happening in this quote. Katniss is volunteering to save her sister Prim from the Hunger Games. Okay? And so if you had never read that quote, if you had never read the Hunger Games and you just read this quote only, you wouldn't likely have a clue of what's going on. So this part of the interpretation explains it for you. Now we got to explain how it proves the claim. Well, remember, the claim says that it drives the conflict of the story. So how does her characterization drive the conflict? Well, here we go. It says, as a result, it initiates her conflict to survive the Hunger Games herself. Okay? Which could ultimately cost her life within the story if she fails. So in other words, since Katniss was so brave and dedicated to save her sister, that's what started the conflict for her to have to survive the Hunger Games herself. So if she hadn't been so brave, she would not have had to survive the Hunger Games herself. But because she was, she had a conflict of her own to endure throughout the story. Okay? So what did we explain? We explained how her characterization created the conflict. All right? As a result, it initiates her conflict to survive the Hunger Games herself, or to survive the Hunger Games, which could ultimately cost her life within the story if she fails. So that is the interpretation. Okay? So the whole paragraph together looks like this. I got the claim in red, the embed and the direct quote in orange and green. That's the evidence. And then the interpretation in blue. Okay? So I'll just read it through. It says the author uses Katniss's bravery and dedication for her family to drive the conflict of the story. Katniss demonstrates her bravery and dedication to her family on many key accounts. One major occurrence happened in the beginning of the story. She provides the account in the text saying, I reach her just as she's about to mount the steps. With one sweep of my arm, I push her behind me. I volunteer, I gasp. I volunteer as tribute. In this segment of the passage, Katniss volunteers to save her sister from the Hunger Games. It proves her bravery to sacrifice her life to save her sister. The author uses this example of indirect characterization to show Katniss's bravery and love for her family. As a result, it initiates her conflict to survive the Hunger Games, which could ultimately cost her life within the story if she fails. Okay? So this is an adequate paragraph response to this literary analysis question. How does the author use characterization to create conflict in the story? Okay? So that is it. Hopefully that is pretty straightforward. Okay? This is a great technique that you can use. I'm going to switch back over. This is a great technique that you can use to respond to a literary analysis question. And it also allows you to show that you've interacted with the literary component and is a good format, orderly way to use textual evidence to prove what you're trying to say. Okay? So I hope that helps. I do encourage practicing it, even if you don't have a literary analysis assignment that you have to write in paragraph form. It is a good thing to practice. So teachers and tutors alike, I do encourage having your students practice CEI. I think it's a good thing. Okay, that should be it. If you have any questions, let me know. Once again, I want to thank you for tuning in. I'll see you next time.